Namaste. I welcome you all to this two-part lecture series which will help you in developing an understanding of the idea of the natural moral law. In the course of these lectures, you would become acquainted with the following themes. First, nature and characteristics of the natural moral law theory. Second, an overview of St. Thomas Aquinas' natural moral law theory. Third, its limitations, criticisms, and some alternatives. Before we begin with the discussion of the natural moral law view, let us briefly try to understand what the phrase natural law stands for, both generally as well as specifically in the context of the ethical view being considered at present. Now, the term law has broadly two familiar usages. We commonly talk about the laws of a country, which may be called the political laws, and the laws of nature. Unlike the political laws, which tend to vary across countries and across times, the laws of nature appear to be more concrete and stable. Furthermore, while the political laws are like commands which can also be disobeyed or even violated, the natural laws are like statements of fact which are inviolable. For instance, in building a multi-story tower on a farmland, while the builder might in fact violate the political laws of the state, yet the builder, in order to make that tower, would be bound by the natural laws such as the law of gravitation, conservation of energy, etc. This sense of universality and unavoidability is what the idea of a natural law tends to convey. It may also be noted that laws, whether legal, social, or physical, whether discovered or constructed, are always open to further verification and modulation. That is, there is always a scope of variability. However, a law which is regarded as being naturally given or naturally ordained somehow discounts the very possibility of such variability and modification. It tends to be associated with ideas of givenness, innateness, inescapability, and it is for this very reason that a natural law also appears to be essential and absolutely necessary. Those who regard the moral law as being a law of nature tend to subscribe to the view that the rules of morality are such that by obeying them, humans attain their ideal nature and actualize the ideal natural relations between themselves and others. It is specifically in this sense that the concept of nature becomes relevant to ethics and morality. One would also observe numerous references to the idea in the history of Western philosophical thought. For instance, while the sophists were of the view that morality was a convention which varied subjectively, Socrates maintained that morality was natural. In a similar fashion, the Stoics too believed that the virtuous life is the life according to nature, nature being governed by one universal law which is fundamentally rational. Cicero was also subscribing to the Stoic view when he said, "True law is right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting," adding also that the law is not one thing at Rome and another at Athens, but it is eternal and immutable, the expression of the command and sovereignty of God. The idea of the natural moral law happens to rely on the presumption that there is a common human nature or essence which is constant, and that it is from this common human essence that ethical principles and standards of morality are derived. Thus, the objective foundation of the natural moral law turns out to be the nature of human beings themselves. The minimum presuppositions for being an ethical subject, according to this view, are freedom and reason. Without these, one cannot be an ethical subject. These minimum conditions remain the same for all, irrespective of the culture, geographical divisions, or even one's age, and they are applicable everywhere. They are therefore available to any human as a human. A natural moral law, thus construed, presents itself as being unvarying, objective, and universal, and it thereby needs to be understood as being committed to the absolute objectivity of moral norms. The view of the moral law as a law of nature was adopted somewhat reluctantly by Christian theologians. This was because they regarded goodness to be a matter of God's divine grace and not as that of a natural law. Yet interestingly, the idea of a law of nature gained a central place in the works of one of the greatest medieval thinkers, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose theory of morality stands out as a paradigmatic instance of the natural moral law theory. Aquinas taught that natural law is itself ordained by God, and that it is concerned with the social life of humans as a creature of space and time, living in the actual world where their relations are to be ordered according to the law of God. According to Aquinas, then, there are two key features of the natural law, the acknowledgement of which also structures his overall discussion of the natural law in Summa Theologia. The first feature is that when we focus on God's role as the giver of the natural law is just one aspect of divine providence. And so, his theory of the natural moral law is from that perspective just one part amongst others of the theory of divine providence. The second feature is that when we focus on the human's role as the recipient of the natural law constitutes the principles of practical rationality, that is, those principles by which human action is to be judged as reasonable or unreasonable. And so, the theory of natural law becomes, from that perspective, the preeminent part of the theory of practical rationality. Aquinas distinguishes four kinds of laws, namely eternal law, divine law, natural law, and human law. Eternal law is comprised of those laws that govern the nature of an eternal universe, including the scientific laws, such as the physical, chemical, biological, psychological, etc. laws by which the universe tends to be ordered. Divine law is concerned with those standards that must be satisfied by a human being to achieve eternal salvation. One cannot discover divine law by natural reason alone. The precepts of divine law are disclosed only through divine revelation. The natural law is comprised of those precepts of the eternal law that govern the behavior of beings possessing reason and free will. The first precept of the natural law, according to Aquinas, is the imperative to do good and avoid evil. This precept is said to be derived from the rational nature of human beings. A human law is a law which is promulgated by human beings. It is said to be valid only insofar as its content conforms to the content of the natural law. In this regard, Aquinas points out, every human law has just so much of the nature of law as is derived from the law of nature. But if in any point it deflects from the law of nature, it is no longer a law but a perversion of law. Therefore, we see that as far as Aquinas' assertion regarding the natural law being an aspect of divine providence is concerned, the fundamental thesis being affirmed by him is that the natural law is a participation in the eternal law, where the eternal law is that rational plan by which all creation is ordered. The natural law is the way the human being participates in the eternal law. Furthermore, the non-rational beings also have a share in the eternal law, however, only in terms of being determined by it. This is because their action non-freely results from their determinate natures, that is, natures the existence of which results from God's will, in accordance with God's eternal plan. Rational beings like us, on the other hand, are able to grasp our share in the eternal law and freely act on it. It is this feature of the natural law that justifies, on Aquinas' view, our calling the natural law a law. For law, as Aquinas defines it, is a rule of action put into place by one who has care of the community. And since God cares for the entire universe, God's choosing to bring into existence beings who can act freely and in accordance with principles of reason is enough to justify our thinking of those principles of reason as law. Thomas Aquinas further identifies the rational nature of human beings as that which defines moral law. He writes, "The rule and measure of human acts is the reason, which is the first principle of human acts." On this view, since human beings are by nature rational beings, it is morally appropriate that they should behave in a way that conforms to their rational nature. This is how Aquinas derives the moral law from the nature of human beings, and this is why it is called a natural law. For Aquinas, the basic presuppositions of morality are, firstly, that the human is a being of reason, and secondly, that he or she is responsible for his or her being. As rational creatures, humans ought to recognize the good and true for the very being of humankind, and that very recognition brings them to their integral fulfillment. The human's inclinations tend to have an orientation towards the good and the true, and the reason recognizes the good and the true and approves them. Finally, humans realize themselves as a body-soul reality, necessarily in relation with other human beings and in harmony with the orientation of their soul towards the good and the true. These presuppositions are not just arbitrary principles from which arbitrary norms are drawn. Rather, they are the very conditions that make morality possible at all. When we focus on the recipient of the natural law, that is, us human beings, it may be asserted that the thesis of Aquinas' natural law theory that comes to the fore is that the natural law constitutes the basic principles of practical rationality for human beings and has this status by nature. The notion that the natural law constitutes the basic principles of practical rationality further implies two things. First, that the precepts of the natural law are universally binding by nature, and second, that the precepts of the natural law are universally knowable by nature. To say that the precepts of the natural law are binding by nature is meant to convey the idea that no beings could share our human nature and yet fail to be bound by the precepts of the natural law. This is so because these precepts direct us towards the good as such, as well as towards the various particular goods. The good and goods provide reason for us rational beings to act to pursue the good and particular goods. As good is what is perfective of us given the natures that we have, the good and these various goods have their status as such naturally. It is sufficient for certain things to be good that we have the natures that we do. It is in virtue of our common human nature that the good for us is what it is. The precepts of the natural law are also said to be knowable by nature. All human beings possess a basic knowledge of the principles of the natural law. This knowledge is exhibited in our intrinsic directedness towards the various goods that the natural law enjoins us to pursue, and we can make this implicit awareness explicit and propositional through reflection on practice. Aquinas believes that there is a core of practical knowledge that all human beings have, even if the implications of that knowledge can be hard to work out, or the efficacy of that knowledge can be thwarted by strong emotions or evil disposition. The view presented by Aquinas leaves us with several unanswered questions. For instance, it is essential to the natural law position that there be some things that are universally and naturally good. But how this universal natural goodness is itself possible is left unexplored. Here one may ask that given the variability of human tastes and desires, how could there be such universal goods? Another central question that the natural law tradition has wrestled with concerns our knowledge of the basic goods. How can we come to know these fundamental goods? And how do we accept that they are exactly and only those which the natural moral law theory specifies? These are issues that have remained matters of debate and contention. Aquinas' theory of the natural moral law remains grounded on the following two theses. Firstly, that it is law because of its place in the scheme of divine providence, and secondly, that it constitutes a set of naturally binding and knowable precepts of practical reason. Now, if both these theses are taken to be the paradigmatic features of any natural law theory in general, then such a moral law theory presents itself as being incompatible with several views in metaphysics and moral philosophy. On the side of metaphysics, it is clear that the natural law view is incompatible with atheism. One cannot have a theory of divine providence without a divine being. It is also clear that the paradigmatic natural law view rules out a deism on which there is divine being, but that divine being has no interest in human matters. Nor can one be an agnostic while affirming the paradigmatic natural law view, for agnosticism is the refusal to commit either to God's existence or non-existence, whereas the paradigmatic natural law view involves a commitment to God's existence. On the side of moral philosophy, it is clear that the natural law view is incompatible with the nihilism about value, that is, the rejection of the existence of moral values. It is also incompatible with the wholesale skepticism about value, for the natural law view commits one to holding that certain claims about the good are in fact knowable, and indeed knowable by all. It is further incompatible with relativist and conventionalist views on which the status of value is entirely relative to one's community or is determined entirely by convention. It is specifically against relativism, for it believes in the truthfulness and universal validity of moral norms. One needs natural law to be able to criticize the ideologies of one's society. In the absence of a natural law, one will be forced to give equal value and weightage to both cannibalism and a democratically ordered society. Finally, a natural moral law also appears to be opposed to historicism, which believes that the human being is an evolving creature and what he or she is will only be revealed by history. Historicism does not believe in the existence of an unchanging human nature. The defenders of the natural moral law view counter historicism by saying that there is a common metaphysical human nature which happens to become manifest in and through historical forms only, and that the essential human nature remains essentially the same all through history. The moral norm which humans discover also appear in a historical situation, but that fact does not contradict the existence of a common nature or of universal moral laws. Thank you.